So we looked at inward corners. Now let's look at inward curves. What happens when we have two curved seams and we want to sew them together? You should have the inward curve base pattern cut from muslin, cut one from muslin, and the inward curve pattern, cut one from a contrast fabric. You should still have your seam line copied and your notches clipped. Same thing here. Seam line should be copied, which I still need to do, and notches should be clipped. So I'm going to mark my seam line here. It is a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I'm just going to mark mine with friction pen, but you can use chalk. And we do have some tailor's tacks as well as notches on this pattern. So there are my two notches. I'm going to sew some quick tailor's tacks, just one little stitch in and out, just so I can transfer these points to my fabric. As soon as I have those marked, I'm going to copy them with friction pen because they just get in my way. I'm not a fan of having tailor's tacks in my way. I am absolutely all for thread tailor's tacks when I'm working with a final garment, but on a sample, I just want them out of my way, so I just copy them real quick and then take those threads out. There we go, remove my patterns. I've got everything copied and I've got my tailor's tacks marked, so I can take these out. If they fall out, it's fine. So we've got a similar situation to our inward corner. I can place these right sides together and surprise, surprise, we have the same problem happening. We've got our seam allowance for our contrast fabric going out and to the right, but then we've got the seam allowance over here for our base fabric going out and to the left. Now, last time with the inward corner, we had to make some reinforcing stitches on the muslin, and then we had to clip into our seam allowance. We're going to do the exact same thing with this as well. So let's isolate the muslin fabric. We can set aside the contrast fabric for now. So I'm going to stitch some reinforcing stitches along my curve between these two tailor's tacks. It's also the same point between these two notches. Your notches are in the same place as your tailor's tack. So if you lose one, you've got a backup. So if you forget to clip, you've got tailor's tacks. If you forget to make the tailor's tacks, you've got notches in the same place. Now, just as we did with the inward corner, I am lazy and I don't want to have to remove these reinforcing stitches later. So I'm going to sew inside of my seam allowance rather than outside of my seam allowance. So again, between my stitching line and my raw edge is the inside of my seam allowance. It's inside my seam allowance. And I am going to zoom in here. And I'm going to give myself a line to follow. Now on the inward corner, we were stitching about a 1/16 of an inch away because we had to clip really, really far in order to get our seam allowance to move in the direction we wanted. So what we're gonna do with these stitches, they're not quite reinforcing stitches. They're what's referred to as stay stitches. It's to help prevent our fabric from stretching out too much on the bias while it's cut, but it also acts as a barrier because we are going to have to clip into this. So our stitches are going to be a little bit different than our inward corners. And I'm going to place them about 1/8 of an inch away from my stitching line. So that's a 3/8 inch seam allowance because that is 1, 2, 3, 4 squares is my 1/2 inch seam allowance. If I reduce 1/8, that's 1, 2, 3/8. So I'm just going to give myself a little line here. Actually, let me change pens so I can identify my stitching line as purple. And I'll mark my stay stitching line in pink. So 3/8 inch, give or take. Doesn't have to be perfect, but about 1/8 of an inch away from our stitching line. And again, we only need to stitch between these notches, between these tailor's tacks. We don't have to stay stitching all the way along. but from this point down to this point. I'm going to head to the sewing machine. And using a number 2 stitch, no back tacking, I'll start right here at my 3/8 inch seam allowance, and I'll stitch all the way along my curve until I reach this point over here. Number 2 stitch, no back tacking, stitching 3/8 of an inch away from my raw edge. Okay. There we go. Starting and stopping close to those tailor's tacks, inside of my seam allowance, number 2 stitching. All right, now we can take a look at putting these 2 pieces together. This is the right side of my fabric, and you should have those curves corresponding. Again, there should be some corresponding notches. So I've got a notch here, right here in this corner here, and I've got another notch down here. So it corresponds to my notches here and there. So again, right sides together. There we go. We got the start here. And again, I'm going to be stitching from my muslin side, so I'm gonna put my pins in, but I'll be switching around. I'll put them in this direction, so it's a little bit easier for you to see what's about to happen. Now, when we did the inward corner, we just snipped once, and then we were able to pivot everything around. We're gonna have to snip way more than one time to get this to turn around on us. So I'm gonna grab my scissors, and I'm going to snip into this seam allowance. I'll show you a close-up here. Right along this little edge. I'm going to snip into this. I can see where my stay stitching is. I do not want to clip through my stay stitching. Do not clip through your stay stitching. We just went through the effort of stitching it in there. We do not want to cut through these threads, but we're going to use this as a guideline, a marker for how close we should snip. Should be pretty close to that stay stitching, but you know, stay about a 1/16 of an inch away from it. That's about as close as I really want to get to my stay stitching. And I'm going to clip every 1/2 inch, 5/8 of an inch or so. It's a little bit more than 1/2 inch. You can see these are much deeper. Here's my notch, so you can see how deep I clipped for my notch. And here's my clippings coming really close to my stay stitching, but I am not clipping through it. I'm going to clip a few more times so you can see what's about to happen. So again, here's my notch that I clipped originally, and then here is my clipping for my stay stitching. I'm going to match up my notches to make sure that those are close. And now as I pivot my muslin fabric, you're going to see that seam allowance start to mimic the shape of my contrast fabric. And I'll show you from this side. There's my contrast fabric underneath there. And I can start to bend this fabric, opening up those clippings, those clipped areas, and it starts to bend in the opposite direction. So I'm going to continue that. I'm going to clip the rest of my seam allowance here. Again, I'm just clipping through the notches. I'm sorry, between the notches. I've got one notch down here. And now I can match up. I've got this pinned here. I'm going to match up my opposite end here. I'm going to grab this side, tilt it around. So again, one more time just so you can see this. I'm grabbing this end over here. I'm going to turn this to the left. I'm actually turning it upside down. So it started right set up like this. I'm going to pivot it upside down so that this edge matches this edge and that these raw edges match up. So one more time. It's curving to here. I'm taking this raw edge and I'm literally flipping it upside down and matching this corner here with my raw edges. Pin through that. Match up my notches. If your notches aren't perfectly matched, perfectly aligned, it's okay. But these raw edges on the side should match, and these raw edges at the top should match. These should match here, and these should match along the side. It's most important to kind of lock down those areas, get those pinned so we know where this should go. And now we can fan out the rest of the muslin. You can see that by clipping, I can now kind of tug these apart and I can start to smooth that muslin fabric into place. There's going to be a bunch of excess. That's the same thing that happened with our inward corner. I'm going to work my way around. I've just turned my work over. So here's my muslin side. And I'm just going to work my way around, matching up the raw edges and pinning. Distributing that fullness. This is another reason why I will be sewing from the muslin side, so I can make sure I'm not getting any puckers or anything while I'm working. There we go. It didn't look very nice, but I've got raw edges matching up. I've been able to clip into this, so now I've got my muslin fabric matching that curve of my contrast fabric. I'll go to my machine again, sew this at a 1/2 inch seam allowance on a number 2 stitch, back tack at the beginning, work my way slowly around this curve, and back tack at the end. Number 2 stitch, back tack. And again, I want to make sure as I work that my raw edges stay matched up. I'm going to be kind of searching, just feeling underneath. You might see me lift my fabric to make sure nothing is going wrong with my contrast fabric underneath. And I want to make sure as I'm sewing that I don't get any puckers or pleats. I can see right here my fabric kind of wants to pucker on itself. I'm just going to kind of push that out of the way so it doesn't get in the way of my needle as I'm stitching. Same thing, work my way around. I can see another pucker wants to form here, so I'm just going to push that out of the way. Anytime you lift your presser foot, make sure your needle is down. That way your stitches don't waver all over the place. As soon as you lift that presser foot, it releases your fabric, and if your needle is up, your needle can kind of deviate all over the place. I'm just kind of pushing the fabric out of the way, pushing my excess muslin up and out of my way, because there is a lot of fullness over here. I'll make sure these are lined up as best I can get them, and back tack at the end. There's my stay stitching, and there's my final stitching. I'm going to check underneath. I got a bit of a pucker here. Not too happy about that. I may redo that. So maybe you'll be lucky and get it to work just great on the first try. This is my 3rd try. I took all of my stitching out of my seam. So I've removed all those stitches down here, and I made another clip here to help relieve some tension. I'm going to overlap my stitches on my seam line, not my stay stitching line, on my seam line. And I'll overlap a couple of these stitches do my best to feel underneath and make sure that fabric stays flat this time. Again, try it once. If it doesn't work, try it again. After the second time, call it done. This is my second time, so I'm calling it done after this. Get my back tack in there. Now I should be able to go to the iron to finish up pressing. And do bring a pair of scissors with you to the iron. That's looking a little bit better. No puckers now, so that's better. Okay, let's go press this out. Now, with the inward corner, we pressed all of our seam allowance out towards our muslin. But for this, I want to press the seam open because I want to show you one more type of clipping that needs to get done on curved seams. So we've seen that we can clip into our seam, just a quick little snip through the seam allowance to help spread the seam allowance open. But when we go to press this, I'll show you really quickly what's about to happen. I'm going to pull this taut and give it a little bit of a press, just so you can start to see what is going to happen. Notice that my contrast fabric gets all buckled up. There's all these puckers and buckling and gathering going on. There's a lot of fullness that gets stuck in there. And if you press it flat, it could lead to like little wrinkles and things. See how it kind of buckles up on itself as you try to press it? It's a lot of excess fabric that could lead to wrinkles that might get pressed into the front of your garment. So we're going to get rid of that. This is another method for reducing bulk in our seam allowances. I want to isolate my contrast fabric. And instead of clipping straight into the seam allowance, I'm going to cut little triangles out. So let me see if I can get this close up on the camera. So in our muslin fabric, we just clip straight in, just straight towards that stay stitching. But here on my contrast fabric, I want to clip out little triangles, little pyramid shapes. All right. So I'm going to snip again, leaving about 1/8 of an inch away from my seam line. I'm stitching from one angle here. Then I'll go in again from another angle here. So I can clip out a tiny little triangle. There we go. So now I've got that little triangle cut out of there. And again, I'll move over about 1/2 inch, 5/8 of an inch, and do the same. Clip out another little triangle. It's more than just a single snip. It's two snips to get little triangles cut out of there. Maybe it's a little bit easier to see there. So it's quite a bit of a cut. Taking 2 little cuts, and I'll show you one more time. Again, we're just snipping through the contrast fabric. That's where we have all that excess fabric we need to reduce. Clip in from one side, angle my scissors. These don't have to be big dramatic triangles. They look big and dramatic only because the fabric is spreading out. At the very most, there may be a 1/4 inch difference. Okay, I'm going to continue that along the rest of this seam allowance. Okay. Now I'm going to press this nice and flat, tug on my fabric a little bit, make sure nothing's rolling under itself. And now I can press this nice and flat, and I should see that excess buckling go away on my contrast fabric. No need to put this onto a ham or a tailor's board. Even though it looks like a curved seam, it doesn't actually produce any three-dimensional structure or shape to our garment. This is what's referred to as a style line. It's a seam right in the middle of the fabric that doesn't produce any kind of shape or fullness. Got some extra seam allowance on my contrast fabric I want to get rid of. It doesn't produce any actual shape to our sample. Our sample should still lay flat. So you don't have to use a tailor's ham or tailor's block or anything fancy for this. It's just a flat seam because it doesn't add any shape. It just happens to be curved in nature. So there we go. Inward curve. Press nice and flat. Again, you shouldn't see any extra buckling or anything. You cut those triangles open, and when you go to press them, they close back on themselves. So they start to close in on themselves, reducing that excess bulk along this curved seam. And that is the inward curve done.